This morning was a lot tougher to get into the work. So here is what I kind of do in those situations. Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name is Tara East. I'm a writer, blogger, YouTuber, and the author of the mystery novel Every Time He Dies. And in this week's video, I want to talk about how every writing session is going to be a little bit different. So yesterday, I sort of had the ideal writing day experience. I woke up in the morning, it was super rainy, drizzly, like no dog walk was happening. So I made a cup of tea, I got out my book and I read for about 40 minutes, did a little bit of journaling. And then because I was kind of in that gentle, creative headspace, I hadn't gotten sucked into the day yet. It was really easy to sit down and open my Word document and just start working on the novel. My level of resistance to the creativity was really low. You've probably heard me talk about Steven Pressfield and his idea of resistance, which is something that we always have as creators. I just feel like the level of resistance can just be different day to day. For me personally, the earlier I can get to the computer and I can get to my story, the better. If I get sucked into other stuff before I get to my manuscript, it's just that much harder to actually get into the story. So today, for example, the weather was a little bit better. So it was like getting up, taking the dogs for a walk straight away. Then I had breakfast, and then there were some errands that I really had to get done straight up. And that took about 2 hours. So then I was kind of like in this head frame then of life administration and doing all of that kind of stuff. So because then I was in that kind of mode, when I sat down to start work on my manuscript, it was really tough. It's like dropping from 5th gear down into 1st gear because you're already in this sort of like super alert state and you're just kind of like, you're very engaged with the real world. Whereas when you're trying to get into your story, you're trying to disengage from the real world and sink into your imaginary world, even if that imaginary world is based on the real world. So like I said, this morning was a lot tougher to get into the work. So here is what I kind of do in those situations. First of all, there is just a level of acceptance that you have to have that it's just not going to be that easy today. So there is a part of me that just has to kind of sit in the discomfort for those 5, 10, 20 minutes where you're just kind of like fighting against getting into the story. And even though you love writing, you kind of rather be doing anything else in that moment. So some of the tactics that I take are definitely putting on some kind of like soundtrack that is supportive to the mood that I'm trying to create in the scene. Or there are particular books that I listen to the exact same soundtrack for the entire writing of the book, so that every time I hear that sound, that music, I am immediately associating that sound, that music with my book, so that then hopefully it's making it easier for my brain to switch over into writing mode. The next thing I might do is just read back a little bit from what I'd written the previous day or from the previous writing session as a way to sort of like feel like I'm walking into the book, like I'm picking the voice back up, I'm getting the thread of what the mood is, where everybody's at, what should be the organic next scene that should follow. Even though I've mapped out, at least loosely, my entire manuscript, there is still like a level of openness around the book, so things can still change at this point. So it is definitely really valuable for me to take that little look back as a way to situate myself within the book, but then situate myself in terms of the character's head frame and the voice that I'm using. So on days where the writing does feel particularly difficult, it can be really useful to lower your bar to lower your goals. So if you're the kind of person who loves to write 2,000 words per session, maybe you need to lower that to like 1,000 words or 500 words. And if you're the kind of person that works to a, say, time limit, then maybe you need to lower that from an hour to 40 minutes to 15 minutes, depending on the level of resistance that you're feeling that day. On that point though, what I often find again and again is if I just stick with the story, if I just white knuckle it through those 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes of resistance, eventually that resistance falls away and your brain becomes engaged with the story. Because our brains are giant problem-solving machines, and writing a book is endless problem solving. Once you sort of like push past that initial bit of resistance, you usually find that the story takes over and you get into some kind of flow state. It may not be the super easy flow state where it feels like dictation rather than creation, but usually it just gets easier than what it felt like when you first started your writing session. Now, every writing session I feel like has a certain warm-up time. Even when there are days that I'm super excited to write, there is still that slight bit of friction, that slight bit of resistance when I open up the manuscript, because writing is tough, it's vulnerable, it's so unknown. You're literally just making it up as you go along, even if you have an outline. So I think because of that, there is always that sort of resistance there, even if it's only light. And for this reason, I think it can be really valuable to figure out what kind of strategies are going to help you to get through your writing on any particular day, but particularly on days when the writing resistance is really high. Now, of course, I think there's absolutely times and days where you just kind of need to give up. Maybe you've given yourself 20 or 30 minutes to get into a session and you just can't get into any kind of flow state. You feel like everything you are writing is really objectively terrible. So maybe on those days, you can give yourself permission to step away from the book and either do something completely different or do something book adjacent. So researching your book, doing some revision, working on a short story, or writing about the book rather than writing the book, if that makes sense. So you could, for example, sit back and reflect on the book that you've written so far. So what is working in the book? What do you like about the book that you've done so far? But then also thinking about, what do you innately already know isn't working? What isn't working in the book? What don't you particularly like about the book? And just reflecting on the manuscript in that way. Because often we don't step into this sort of critical mind until we're in the editing phase. But it can also be very useful to do these little check-ins while you're working on drafts. So drafts 1, 2, 3, those kind of early drafts. Because this is really going to make the revision process easier later when you're doing these little mini check-ins along the way, because you can start to make those changes as you write forward. If you do come across something like, I actually feel like this character should have a sibling, or this character should be a different gender, a different age, these two characters should have a different dynamic. If you come up with something like that in your reflection, what I would suggest is to write forward having made those change as if it has always been that way. I would avoid the temptation to jump back to the beginning and rewrite the whole novel with this new thing, because you might get further along into the book and realize, oh no, my original thinking was actually better, and this new change doesn't actually work with the story that I'm telling. Now, I'd kind of love to hear from you. Do you feel like there are wild fluctuations in terms of your emotional state when you're approaching a writing session? Some days it's easy, some days it's hard. And what kind of strategies do you use on the days when it's tough? Do you give yourself permission to just give up? Do you shorten the amount of time that you're writing, or do you do something else? I'd really love to know, so please leave a comment below. Now, if you'd like even more writing advice, you can of course head to my website, taraeast.com, and dive into the archives. While you're there, please consider joining my email newsletter. When you do, I'll send you a free gift. Plus, you'll get a newsletter in your inbox every single Thursday morning, including a note by me, a quote of the week, and some resources that I've recently loved and think you will too. Thank you so much for watching this weird, rambly video. I hope that it was at least a little bit helpful. Now go do some writing because the world really does need more books.